Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Have you been part of a team that just clicked? The kind where people challenge each other, have each other's backs, and get incredible things done. If you want to understand how that happens, then today's episode will hit home. My guest today is Leo Bottary, author of Peernovation and a pioneer in helping leaders turn peer pressure into peer accountability. He's worked with over 800 teams and CEO forums around the world, and what he's learnt could reshape the way you lead your team. We talk about what thriving teams get right, how psychological safety is built and rebuilt, and why the best teams don't leave feedback to chance. This conversation is energising, honest, and full of actionable insights that'll get you thinking about how to build a thriving team. Let's dive in. I'm thrilled today to introduce our guest, Leo Bottary, someone who is not only studied what makes peer groups thrive, but has also translated it into a really actionable book called Peernovation. So it's just launched its second edition with a background in CEO advisory groups and a passion for turning peer insights into team innovation. Leo helps leaders build cultures of collaboration, accountability, and trust. And these are all qualities we know are essential for thriving teams. And when I read through your book, there's so many synergies with the work that I do with leaders and teams as well. So I'm really looking forward to expanding my thinking today. Leo is a sought after speaker, facilitator, and the founder of Peernovation. And when Harvard Amy Edmondson writes your forward, you know that there's something truly special about the work that you're doing. So welcome, Leo.
Well, thank you very much. It is such a pleasure being here. And by the way, Amy could not have been more gracious and generous in doing that. And we can explore the little backstory around that if you like,
Yeah, so
whenever.
how
But
did that
it
all come
was
about? Tell me a bit about that.
this gentleman, Roman Terrican, who was a scholar out of George Washington University, was putting together a panel uh, at the Academy of Management annual meeting in Chicago last year.
Mhm.
And it was in August, and he's putting together this panel that's half practitioners, half academics. So he said to me, "Hey, would you like to participate on this panel because of the work you do?" And I said, "Great." And I said, "Who else is going to be on the panel?" And the moment he said Amy Edmondson, I'm like, "Yeah, I'm there. I'm
Yeah.
going to do that."
Very
You
much
know,
welcome.
because let's face it, I mean, when you think about CEO forums and any kind of peer group for business leaders, psychological safety is at the core of all of that. So I've respected her work for a long time. I thought what a wonderful opportunity to be on a panel with her, engage with her a bit on the panel, and of course meet her shortly thereafter. Um, we traded a couple of emails over, a 4 or 5, 6 month period, but we didn't really engage with one another a whole lot. But when it became clear that I was going to write the second edition, I was thinking about the forward. And I could have certainly asked the person who wrote the forward last time to update it, which would have been great. But by the same token, the difference in this book was that psychological safety was going to play even more center stage. So I thought to myself, what better way to accentuate that would be to invite the woman who is synonymous with psychological safety, who coined the term back in 1999, to see if she'd be willing to write the forward. So, of course, I craft this elaborate email about how, here's what I'm looking to do, here's what I'm hoping, and here's why I would like you to write it. And I said, but let's take this in two stages. I said, one, would you even be open to doing it? She's got, I mean, her schedule and everything else. Is this something she even wants to take on? And then secondly, I want you to review the manuscript and see how, I handle psychological safety, how I handle peer how this all connects together, and if she feels comfortable with the book and the way it's written and all of that. So I have since thought about this in kind of Top Gun Maverick terms, because if you remember the movie,
Yeah.
we had number one and miracle number two. So miracle number one was she writing me back saying, yes, I would be open to doing it. So there was miracle number one right there. And so from there, though, I really kind of felt like, you know what? It's already going to be a better book because now I've got to finalize a manuscript for the top scholar in the world in psychological safety. So you better bring your A game, right?
Yeah.
Makes sense. So I always felt like even if it's something that she, chose not to do or couldn't do or whatever, that it made it better anyway. So fortunately, I give her the manuscript. It was a while later. She was traveling all over the world at the time. And next thing you know, I get this 1,200 plus word forward in my email saying, well, this is a draft and is it okay? And I'm like, yeah, I think it's going to be great. You know? So it was really, again, she was really terrific. And by the way, not as if I didn't ask her for enough already, but I remember going to the recording studio to, voice the audiobook. And I was talking to the sound engineer, and I said, it would be kind of interesting, right? What if we could get Amy to actually read the forward? What do you think about that? I said, that would be awesome if you could make that happen. So again, I just asked. I just said, what do you think about doing it? And she writes me right back and said, I'd love to do it. So she recorded it and sent the audio file, and it's now part of the audiobook today. And again, it's always amazing when you meet certain people and you just get a sense of not only we all know kind of what they can do and all of what you see from the outside, but when you really get a sense of who they are, that was just really extraordinary and just has been a wonderful experience. So it was good stuff. And obviously, I'm very grateful that she supports the work.
Yeah, like she, for me, has been so pivotal in the work that I do all the time, and her generosity is just amazing. And hearing stories like that, even when I had initially posted something and tagged her in it, and she responded when I was heading to Harvard last year, I had quite a few people contact me privately on LinkedIn to say, "Oh, Amy caught up with me for lunch when I was there, and this and that." And I just thought, what a lovely, authentic person who's so generous with her thought leadership as well, and helping to kind of leverage up others that are doing the work that we do, which is great. Yeah. So you mentioned the second edition, and the first edition came out 5 years ago, and you mentioned that you've bolstered it up with psychological safety. What other new ideas have you brought into the new edition of the book?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think part of it was new ideas and updates, and part of it was just some emphasis and some things that I thought deserved more attention than the first book got. But to be fair, I worked with about 125 groups and teams at the time that I wrote the first edition in 2020. That number eclipsed 800 by the time I wrote this.
Yeah.
So I always consider myself a student of my work first. And I felt like I learned so much over the 5 year period that there was just so much to add. And while the first edition dives pretty deeply into each of the five factors that make for high performing peer groups and teams, it didn't focus nearly enough attention on the three dynamics that are common to the highest performing CEO peer groups in the world, common to the highest performing teams. And I thought that, well, the five factors aren't going to be very relevant to you if you don't quite know what it is you're trying to achieve. And I think it was important to really have a part one of the book focused primarily on a lot of the big ideas and big things that groups and teams really do well. But then to suggest that none of that happens by putting a bunch of people in a room and hoping for the best. So that's where the five factors come into play about having the right people who enjoy psychological safety, who are productive, have a culture of accountability that's largely based on having a real sense of personal responsibility for what they do, and leadership that is basically based on servant leadership. The idea that the leader is not there so that, out of some act of self-aggrandizement or because they, want to pad their resume. They're there because they truly care about the people, in the group as members, and they see their team as not something that's there to make them look good. They believe their role as a leader is to create all the conditions possible to help that team be most successful. So, and then it just kind of the back part of it gets into part three, deals with some common challenges, deals with some metrics, deals with maybe a readiness survey that people should think about, and then just kind of giving people some here's a how to act. Here's a time for action now. So what do you do with all this material? How do you go forward? So I kind of felt like this edition, again, helped a lot by a really good forward by Amy Edmondson, and also the CEO and editorial director of CEO World wrote a beautiful afterword, I think. It was tight and succinct, and felt like the perfect punctuation to the book as well. So, my hope, of course, is that people, there's a lot of stuff on teams out there. People come at it from a lot of different directions. I think largely they come to a lot of very similar conclusions,
Mm,
but I also think there's a reason that people pay attention to certain things because some approach connects with them in a way that others don't, and that's okay. That's kind of what I think this is all about. So my hope is that people who may be interested in learning what CEO forums are all about, how they do what they do, and how the best of those groups behave so brilliantly in many respects, how to bring those principles and practices to the teams in your company. Because I think it can make not only for higher performing teams, but I think a lot happier teams too.
yeah. So tell me a bit about this work that you do with CEO forums and CEO peer groups and what the link then is to how they bring that back to the teams that they lead.
So the first book, The Power of Peers, was written in 2016, and it was designed basically to be a narrative that would show people what this value proposition of peer groups was all about. Because I was actually working for Vistage at the time. I headed up brand and corporate communication. And I've been there for about 6.5 years. Private equity purchased the firm actually late 2012. And in early 2013, I led a brand refresh. And I'm going around the country and I'm talking to CEOs and business leaders who weren't part of groups. And I might say, well, how do you learn? How do you grow? How do you bring new thinking into your organization? And to a person, they would say things, well, I read books, I have a coach, I hire consultants, I go to events and conferences, I watch TED Talks. Some went to executive development programs at places like Harvard and Stanford. But I mean, no one, zero, responded with the idea that being in a peer group was even in their consideration set. So when I was reporting on the status of the rollout to the board of directors, I said to them, I'm not sure how long you're all going to be content with this being a great kept secret. Because as I see it, the number of people that could be in a group is like this big, and the number of people are, which is about this tiny. And I basically said, and a big reason for that is we're trying to sell a Mercedes to someone who doesn't even understand what a car is. So the idea was put the book together not to be some kind of vanity piece, some kind of hardcover brochure about Vistage, but to actually work with our competitors. We worked with folks from YPO and EO and a host of other organizations around the world to say we want to put something together that's truly about the category because we believe that the more people who know about it, the more people will likely participate and they'll choose the group that's right for them. And I think that's kind of the approach we had with it back then. And so from that work, I developed a workshop that I do for brand new groups because I think people join a group like this and they think they know what they joined, but not really. I mean, in fairness. So the idea is try to say, well, who do you want to be when you grow up? Let's talk about what you can really do together. And I think it's a very empowering, unifying exercise. It's about a 3 hour workshop that really creates a whole level of clarity and intentionality about what they do and how they do it. Conversely, I've worked with groups and do a lot of work with groups that have been together 20 years, 25 years. I worked with a group just 10 days ago where one of the members was a 34-year member.
Oh, wow.
And so I remember the first time going in front of like a really experienced group like this. And I'm standing in the front of the room and I'm like, all right, we're going to work on the group today. And they're all looking at me like, really? I think we kind of got this by now.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure they weren't absolutely correct. Right? So, but on that day and every day since, what you kind of recognize is that the better they understand the value proposition, the more and more easily they get to see the opportunities for them to up their game, to kick it into another gear. And that's really fun to watch. That's really wonderful to see groups that really get it, to look at maybe where they've gotten complacent or where they could add some new things that they haven't done before in order to kind of freshen things up for them a little. So you try to help them maximize the value of their experience, which I think is not only going to help them grow and do what they want to do and as far as what they want to get out of it as individuals, but it's probably going to improve retention in the group, right? Because the more you're getting out of the value proposition, the more you're going to remain in it. And I try to help them build can't miss experiences. In other words, when your monthly meeting comes up, you're not thinking anything but I will move heaven and earth on my calendar in order not to miss that time with my fellow peers. And I think when you can do that, that's great stuff. And that's A lot of what I really try to do with these groups, whether they're brand new or whether they've been around forever. And the extra step into this now, of course, is to say, by the way, what we just did together here, we can build the bridge between what you do here and what you can bring to your companies. And then we talk about how to do that.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I think when you bring peers together, that essentially learning from each other and then working out how they can apply what they've learned back in their organizations. They can really lean on each other to draw on each other's past experience. And it's almost like a peer mentoring group as well as learning that happens there. So
100%.
yeah. So how do peers then shift to, like, if we think about peers being about their, I guess, individually, the CEO comes to a CEO forum, how do they then actually integrate some of that learning back into their organizations?
So when you think about it, one of the things that I share with them is sometimes when people define groups, they almost see it or characterize it as a kind of lesser than version of a team.
Mm,
Like they'll say, oh, they're a group. They're not really a team. And they kind of use that kind of language and that emphasis with it. I see that very differently. I see groups and teams assembled for very different reasons. A group comes together for the benefit of the individuals around the table.
mhm,
Okay. So if you got a group of CEOs there, they are coming there so that they can walk away with things that can make them a better leader and help them lead their companies that much more effective. Teams come together to create a shared work product, right? It could be to build something, a product or service. It could be if you're a sports team and you're trying to win a Stanley Cup or an NBA championship, you can only do that as a team. You can't send someone out there by themselves and expect that to happen, right? So part of it is showing them that in many respects, groups and teams are different,
mm.
but the things that make them successful are actually exactly the same. And actually, what I do at the end of the meeting, I give them a DIY version of something they can take back to their company that they can use with their executive leadership team. They can, use it as part of an employee development day if they like. And it gives them an introduction into this whole material around peer innovation and how we can be more intentional about clarity, about communication, about collaboration, about improving the capacity of our team. And so that's a first step. And then oftentimes, two things will happen. They will either use that version, run it, and then say to me, we want to take this further. Come join us and help do that. Or they look at the DIY version and say, yeah, we don't want to do that. Could you come do it for us? And which I will do as well. But then it's so interesting because it takes many different forms. Because again, I don't go into any of these companies and tell people what they should or shouldn't be doing. So they are able to take the models and frameworks that I use in my time with them to really develop their own solutions that they've agreed upon and they can own. And I think that's kind of the magic a little bit there. And then I think the big part about it and what makes it have sustainability and gives it some real legs is I show them how to keep all of these things front and centers because you have to be intentional every single day about these things. The moment you think to yourself, I'm going to check off the box, I got this, that'll be the day you don't. So it's almost like a relentless commitment to all of those little things that are the difference between being a pretty good team and being a really great team.
So thinking about teams, because I guess I'm writing my second book, Thriving Teams. What do you think is the
Can't
hardest
wait
part?
to read it. I hope you
Yeah,
do.
I can't wait to finish writing it. I just need some time to actually just sit and write. But what's the most challenging part about building a thriving team, in your opinion?
It can depend. I would suggest, though, that psychological safety can be a challenge early on because they're not quite sure, right? They've got to stick their toes in the water a little bit. You've got to try to figure out how you can inspire some psychological courage among some of the people who are the more likely sharers, right? They're just you know, more, inclined to do that. They just seem to be open and they'll share and they'll talk and they will be vocal in meetings, but engage everyone in that conversation and show that what that person did and how they shared and how they were vulnerable with the group, that the conversation went in such a way where people like, wow, everyone really leaned into that. Everyone they feel good about the experience. It not only benefited that individual, but everyone else as well. And I think once that can happen, it kind of gives them the tacit permission that it's okay for me to do that too. And over time, you get more and more people that start getting involved and sticking their toes in water and realizing, well, the environment seems safe enough, so let's be able to engage one another. I do these meetings virtually oftentimes, not all the time by any stretch, but when I do them virtually, I use a platform called Circles. So rather than to do it on Teams or Google Meet or Zoom or something like that, Circles is such a visually different experience that you feel like I'm in a different meeting than all of my other meetings, that the rules are different. We behave differently. Things are okay in this meeting. It's not recorded. Confidentiality is sacrosanct in these meetings, all of that. So it makes it easier for people to accept that there's a different set of ground rules here about
Mm.
how we're going to engage one another. None of us knows everything. We all need help. We've all made mistakes. It's all okay.
Yeah.
Let's just dig in and talk about what we can do together. And I think initially it takes a little time to establish that vibe, if you will, or that sense in the room and among the group. But once you do, then it's almost like now they're dying for it. Now they just are really pretty amazing. And I think oftentimes I'm always thrilled at the generosity of people with one another, especially when they start. A big part of this process too isn't just I want to learn your job, you learn mine, we communicate more effectively and all that. They learn about each other as people. There's you've got to somehow just connect to the kind of collective humanity that's around that room and all the things we share and all the stuff we're going through in our lives while we're all trying to do a really good job at work. And I think to the extent that people start to know each other well, learn each other's backstories, kind of figure out that, you know what, we get up every day just trying to do our very best. And I think as long as we do that for one another long enough and often enough and build that trust, it makes a big difference.
Yeah. And so, what do you recommend for leaders to build that psychological safety with teams? Because I guess they might not have another platform that they can use, or in the day to day interactions, they might be meeting face to face or on the approved platform for their organization. So, what strategies do you suggest for them to either rebuild psychological safety when it's not there or create psychological safety?
I think that part of what I mentioned in the book is that if you're a CEO and you've never been in a group before and you're wondering about all this stuff, you should just join a group and experience it firsthand because that's really going to make you much more of a believer in terms of making sure that you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is actually really important. If we could bring this into our company, not because somebody told me or because I read it in a book or someone, they watch a video about it or something like that. They've actually experienced what that can feel like. And so I like it when CEOs and C-suite executives and all can actually participate in those settings and get a sense of what it's like and what we're talking about. And I think it can give them an appreciation for what you're trying to create inside the organization. And by the way, if you're a CEO, what better gift than to have the free flow of information about what's really going on in your company in real time? So that you don't have people feeling like, "Ooh, I can't admit that," or "I gotta hide this mistake," or "I've gotta cover up this thing before anyone finds out." Because all that leads to is something that could have been solved with a phone call if someone just said, "Hey, here's what happened, I messed up," or whatever. They find out about it 6 months later where it becomes a nightmare to try to fix it, and maybe they can't even trace it back to the source of what really happened and why, and there's no learning at all that takes place, and it's just a mess. So, I think when CEOs see the benefit for themselves and the organization, it really becomes huge. And I think for CEOs, I did a symposium for Seton Hall University one time where I talked about the idea of employees and the fact that it is your responsibility to speak truth to power. And I offered some guidelines about how to go about doing that. It was years later that I finally also realized that that's great, but that's only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is as leaders, are we creating the environment that makes it safe for employees to speak their truth? Right? So it's got to be a little bit of both there. And that can take time. You look at a lot of these companies that have a high degree of psychological safety, which, as you know, and Amy has a wonderful two by two, which speaks to this, is The higher the psychological safety, the more likely you're going to have a very healthy culture of accountability where people will truly accept personal responsibility for bringing their best. And this is where instead of the leaders being that top down, holding people accountable, like the old model of everyone coming into work like they're playing defense every day,
Yeah.
you have peers who really lift each other up. I remember years ago, I worked for Mullen advertising agency. I was in their office in Boston at the time. And I remember going to a meeting, and it was a meeting for a prospective client. And we were all supposed to go there and be prepared to talk about how we might approach this. Now, I prepared for the meeting, but when I showed up to the meeting and I saw the level that everyone else was prepared, I was like, "Whoa." It was like a welcome to the NFL moment for me, truly.
Yeah.
And I thought so I didn't have a boss that was beating on me telling me, "You need to be better prepared." In fact, I think got away with it enough during the meeting because I was prepared, I did show up, but I knew I wasn't quite as prepared as everyone else. So what do? I realized next meeting, I need to up my game because if I wanna play in this league, I need to be bringing a lot more to the table. Nobody had to tell me that.
Yeah.
But by the power of everyone's example, that's just how they roll, and they continue to drive each other in, I think, a really powerful way. Their logo, by the way, for Mullen Lowe today, it's still an octopus, but years ago, it was an octopus with boxing gloves. And I always loved that because it reminded me a little bit about what it was like to go to work there every day because it was a very combative environment.
Yeah.
But what you realize pretty quickly is that these people aren't fighting against each other. They're fighting for the best idea. And what they recognize is the more they challenge each other, the better the work gets. And that's why we're all in this. This is what we're here to make happen. So again, you start seeing environments like that where you can create a situation where you get the right people in that room and the right peers together and what they can do to lift each other up if you create that environment. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm so excited about this work because of what I know it can achieve.
Yeah. I love the healthy peer pressure to help kind of one lift your standard of performance is what I'm hearing, but also that peer accountability that happens for us to be better. How do teams build that peer accountability rather than it being leader led?
It's interesting. I've given some thought to this, and it reminds me of when I think about. I'm an adjunct professor for Rutgers University as well, and when I think about over the last 17 years or so that I've been teaching, and I think about the very best students I've ever had, they didn't just produce a work; they had somehow the ability to be so great at what they did, but rather than create distance between themselves and everyone else, they had this way of inviting people along for the ride. And you need a few people like that in your company that inspire that kind of commitment and that belief that I can do that too. It's one thing to be purposeful and have your why and all these other kinds of things. But if you think about it, you go back to an agency like Mullen Lowe, and these things don't happen overnight. But I'm pretty sure if you approached the folks at Mullen Lowe 20 years ago and said to them that you're going to compete for global clients with the likes of Chiat Day and Leo Burnett and all of these incredible agencies around the world, they would have looked at you like you little nuts. Today, they are every bit as great as any agency on the planet, and they know it. And in a healthy way, not in an arrogant way, but in a real confident way. Not that to suggest that they think we're better than others, but that they have such a belief in themselves. It inspires you to believe in them.
Mm.
And so that becomes a real important aspect of it. And I think when people can start believing that and doing that for one another, it starts to become huge. In my book, I jokingly tell this, well, not jokingly, I may give an example, but so I'm from Boston originally. So in 2004, after the Boston Red Sox had not won a World Series for 86 years, they were in the American League Championship playoffs with the New York Yankees. They were down 3-0 in the series. Every one of the countries like, this is over. Why? Because no one in the history of Major League Baseball has ever come back from a 3-0 deficit to win a series.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they kind of adopted this, why not us? Why can't we be the first ones to do it? We've worked hard. We've had spring training, 162 game season. We've been through all this stuff. We can't just lay down and lose game 4 and call it a day, and one at bat at a time. They fought back, got it to 3-3. They actually in the clubhouse watched the movie Miracle, which chronicled, of course, the U.S. Olympic hockey team gold medal victory in 1980 in Lake Placid as something that just inspired them to believe in one another. And they went out, won game four, 10-3, and then went on to sweep the World Series against the Cardinals four straight. There's there's something about that though, that unless you have that belief and understanding that you can actually make this happen, you're gonna have a very difficult time doing it. And
Yeah.
this is where people can help each other believe in each other.
Yeah. So that self-belief, or also like our peers challenging us to do our best work. But I'm also hearing, like, thinking about even, the spectators and the other people around are almost like your stakeholders that are watching, or your customers or your clients that are also need to have that belief in you, and you have that pressure, that healthy pressure to achieve for them as
You
well.
bet.
Happens within
Uh,
organizations.
it's such a great point. Think about all of the other, to using your word, stakeholders that are involved
Yeah.
with that. It's the fans, it's the media, it's everybody,
Yeah. Yeah.
that is really hoping that the team isn't gonna lay down. It isn't gonna just give up.
Yeah.
That despite how bad it looked, but wasn't over yet. So what are you
Yeah.
doing?
And I think it's that balancing act between, that pressure or blame, or that happens both for teams, sporting teams, but also in organizations, with accountability and actually it being a positive force for us to actually do our best work and be at our best and
Part
not blame
Right.
or finger point.
And part of what inspires that, and I know chatted about this, and it was something you wanted to chat about, was something we call the learning achieving cycle.
Yeah.
And the learning achieving cycle is one of those three dynamics that really great groups and really great teams all have. And so the learning achieving cycle really just represents a mechanism for continuous improvement, right? So every great team has a mechanism for continuous improvement. And by the way, any great team you can think of, whether it's business, sports, the military, medicine, whatever it happens to be. But if you think about it in sports terminology, all of the greatest teams you can think of, they may use different language around this, but there's not one of them that regards winning the championship as their goal. Not
Mm.
one. Their goal is, how do we get better every day? How do we have that attention to detail, that commitment to excellence, that culture that drives us in a way that helps us believe that we can do great things? Because if we know if we can do that really, really well, championships then become our reward. And so it's a really different mindset when you think about it, because you can sit around and hope you're going to win a championship and kind of do things, or you can really focus on what it takes to making that happen. And you're always going to put yourself in a position to at least compete for it if you do. And so that becomes a really important factor in terms of learning, sharing, applying, achieving, and then celebrating. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of celebrating. And that was brought forth by visiting many teams. And how many of you think are out there celebrating? Not a
Mm.
lot. Not as much as they're hitting their goal and they're on to what's next and they're on to the next thing and the next thing after that. And it's
Yeah.
exhausting for everyone involved. And yet, when you see the difference between teams who celebrate those small wins, they'll typically get the large ones more often. Or when you see a team that has the wherewithal to say, look where we were 2 years ago and look where we are now, right? And because so whatever challenge that's ahead, you've been through many of those challenges already. You've built a track record for being able to do tough things, do difficult things, and
Mm.
be successful at it. So whatever's ahead is you've got this. And this starts to fuel that belief we're talking about, that you can make things happen and that you can achieve higher standards of excellence because you're absolutely capable of doing that. And you prove it to one another each and every day.
I think it's so important because we often don't pause to reflect on how much we've actually achieved and then celebrate those successes, because we're always on to the next thing. We've got so many balls in the air. So, what are some practical things that teams can do to really embed that learning, achieving loop? Like what, and actually create those opportunities to celebrate success? Is there anything practical you suggest?
Yeah, I think it's important to, again, it kind of comes back to that word intentionality.
Mm.
When you think to yourself, how are we going to celebrate? And some of this is philosophical too, right? Because let's say that our team's got a project, but it's not going to be 2 years before it's going to be done, right? So you have to almost have the mindset right away that you could have the mindset where we say, all right, let's just keep our eye on the prize. Because if we do that, boy, we're going to be right there. And that's going to inspire us over 2 years in order to get there. Typically, that isn't how that goes. It's not unlike if you've ever climbed a mountain and you look at the peak, you climb for 10 minutes, you look at the peak again, and it looks exactly the same as it did 10 minutes earlier. You're thinking, I'm making no progress at all. Drives you crazy, right? And it's emotionally exhausting when that happens. Then try looking at the peak, marking where you start, climb for 10 or 15 minutes and look behind you. And that spot you just left is going to look like the tiniest little dot in the landscape. And you're going to be like, whoa, that's amazing what we just did. Completely reframes what you're looking to do. One is gonna really give you energy to press on and know you're making progress, and the other is gonna be like, "Ugh," you're gonna be lamenting and, "Oh my god, I still have look how far I have to go all the time." And so, part of it philosophically is kind of embedding things, and then also figuring out what are some of the practices and rituals and some of the things we can do to both celebrate individuals as well as celebrate the team.
Mm.
And what does that look like? And that can be a whole range of things that people tend to do. And again, I just encourage people to do what's right for you. Have a combination of recognition that comes from the leadership, but also comes from one another, peer to peer
Mm.
stuff.
Right.
Like who best exhibited X value that we really care about last month? Oh, Jennifer did, or Brian did, or whomever. And then come that month, they get to give the award to someone else on the team as they're going along. And again, it helps keep each other. And those peer to peer awards, by the way, tend to actually be more meaningful for those employees than even things bestowed on them by the leadership. So I think there's a lot of things you can kind of do. Hyper communication obviously is really important. Humans are really bad with gaps in information. However, we don't know it long enough. We will fill it in with our own narrative, and it's
Yeah.
90% wrong, And so that becomes a real challenge. So
Mm.
I think if we keep people close, communicative, appreciating what they're doing for each other every day, willing to lend a hand, recognizing that maybe someday it's not going to be a great day for me. Could be something going on at home. It could be whatever. But you know what? I got your back today because
Mm.
next week when you're struggling with something, I'm going to help you do what you need to do. And that's where that servant leadership triad in the book really comes into play. It's not like the leader up here and the team is over here somewhere, where the leader, in my view, becomes a part from the team, not a part of it. And if the leader becomes a part of the team and you all believe that you have a shared responsibility for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, I don't care if it's getting to the top of that mountain or it's how much fun you have, how productive you are, how accountable you want to be, whatever it happens to be, every one of you owns it. And by the way, when you're together, because think about what happens when you've got the leader over here and the team over here. Things start to go sideways. What happens? The leader's blaming the team's blaming the leader. You get all this finger pointing going on, and it becomes ridiculous. Have a team that celebrates and wins together, but also has each other's backs when things get challenging. That creates a completely different dynamic.
Definitely. I think teams need to create a feedback culture because really noticing when people are doing things right and calling it out and having that positive recognition of each other, but also that then links to when things aren't going well, actually not stepping over issues or assuming that the leader needs to have those conversations. We can hold each other accountable and have some open feedback conversations too. I think it's really, really important.
100%. They need feedback culture, and you also make sure for sure, and this is why the psychological safety is so important. You can't be afraid to ask for help.
Yeah.
And this is huge in a lot of companies. I actually do I do a webinar on something called the courage to ask for help.
Mm.
And it starts, and I'll do it on Mentimeter a lot of times, where whether it's in person or virtual, and and Mentimeter, of course, allows you to upload PowerPoint slides, and then of course you can pull questions and things like that. So I do it in the form of word cloud, and I say, how does asking for help make you feel? And to a person, there's a few positive words up there, but most of it is incompetent, terrible, helpless, you name it. It is not great because they see asking for help as a sign of weakness.
Mm.
But in fact, when you talk to really successful people, they see it as an act of resourcefulness. And that's the difference. So when you finally get them to transition to the idea that asking for help is what successful people do, that's how they're wired. They recognize we have resources around me that none of us knows everything. Let's help each other. And sometimes too, it's even how we ask for help. All right. I can either ask you, I need your help, which now feels I need the help, right? It's just a bad sentence in many respects. But how about I would love your help on this project? So now
Mm.
it's extending it as an invitation. It's also an acknowledgement to you that you can make this project better by your involvement as opposed to me just doing it alone, right? And that there's something just a little more, I think, inviting for all involved when you can treat it as an invitation and not some kind of a request. And so I think when people start developing some skills around reframing some of these things, it's important. And clearly the same thing with feedback. A few situations with companies where I'll do this game called Toss Me Some Feedback. And it involves you play it with like cornhole, and you have one person blindfolded, another person is four-person team, the other person next to them gives them the little bean bags, the other person retrieves them, and someone else is keeping score. So the first round is the person is completely blindfolded. No one can say anything, and they're just tossing them, and there's not a whole lot of positive result from that. Next round is that the person tossing the beanbag can ask yes or no questions. Am I too
Mm.
long, too short, too left, too right, whatever it happens to be, and then they start zeroing in what's going on. Then in the third round, everybody in the team can shout anything they want at any time they want to help try to guide the person towards something, right? So the more feedback, obviously, the person gets who's tossing the bean bags, the more successful they're gonna be. And so it's just a fun kind of exercise to get people kind of realizing that, yeah, okay, I could walk around like the blindfolded guy and think I'm just gonna go toss them in, or maybe a little feedback wouldn't kill me.
Yeah, what a great exercise, but also kind of metaphor of the amount of times that we're shooting blind and not getting any feedback loops and not necessarily having the support of the people around us, or people are observing what's happening, but not feeling comfortable to speak up and kind of offer support because they don't feel like they want to hurt people's feelings or make them feel or other things like that. So, what a great exercise to really harness that. And I really like the reframe of the request to an invitation. I think that is really, really powerful because it shifts the it being about me to being about we and us actually coming together, which I know you talk about a fair bit in your book too.
And that speaks all to psychological safety too. One of the things that, you know, I think is a real principle of psychological safety is that trusting intent. The University of Connecticut women's basketball team, for example, one of the top programs in all of college sports in the US for the last 30 or 40 years, the freshmen often will complain that the head coach is yelling at them too much. And you know what the seniors say? When he stops yelling at you, that's when you got to be worried. He's yelling at you because he cares, because he
Mm.
believes in you, because it may seem harsh in that environment. And of course, the feedback we're talking about in the workplace is not nearly,
Mm.
delivered in that way. But I think the reality is that when someone comes to you, because we know it's not easy to do, and they're trying to give you feedback on something, you want to take the default position that they're doing it because they care about me, not because they're trying to beat me up, not because they're trying to call me out. And if you can take it in that spirit, and you can serve one another in that way, it makes an enormous difference.
Yeah. And I think it's like it makes it about the team. It's funny because when I was reading through your book, I just a few weeks earlier watched Apollo 13, the movie. Not I wasn't reading, it wasn't a documentary, but the movie with Tom Hanks
Yeah,
with my kids, because we've been talking about going to the moon and all of that. And there's this great scene where the astronauts that can't go because he's been in contact with someone else helps them actually come back to earth. And I know that you use that story from a kind of a learning and team. But I think you don't talk about the movie. I think you actually talk about Apollo 13 as well. But
no, no, it was the movie.
oh, it's the
I
movie as well. Okay,
no,
yeah.
Tom Hanks and oh yeah,
It was funny
Ed
because
Harris,
I was
Ed
like, "Oh, I
Harris,
read about this
you
in my
know,
book," and then a few
incredible.
weeks later I read and I was like, "Oh, damn, Leo's already done that." No. But I think it's a great example of teams coming together to really have each other's backs and learn together and yeah, it's
The task in front of them and the stakes were just unbelievable when you really think about
oh,
it.
so high, and the whole world's looking at
Communicating
them.
what they had to, no visuals, no, I mean,
Yeah.
it was just outrageous actually, and pretty, excuse me, impressive doesn't even begin to touch it, you know?
Yeah. And we're talking about spectators and stakeholders and pressure, like, talk about the whole world watching what your next
Yeah.
move's gonna be, and, yeah, it ended up being successful because they came back alive, which is all about the team.
And you know what's so interesting is that people who focus on what has to be done, who lean into their preparation, and they don't get consumed by the consequences.
Mhm.
That becomes a very big difference too in high pressure situations when you've got teams who work together, or you think about, and again, I hate to use a kind of a sports metaphor in this, but it reminds me of like you could watch like March Madness, okay? And you've got an NCAA final and you've got some kid in the free throw line, 19 years old, who's going to make 2 free throws in front of the world, basically,
Mm.
or his team loses a national championship, right? And there's two kind of kids in that moment. There's one kid who gets consumed by the consequences, okay, gets consumed by the whole result of it all. And then there's the other kid that says, I've made this shot in the gym 100,000 times.
Mm.
And they just gently stroke it through the net, and it is this sight to see when you see someone lean into their preparation as opposed to get consumed by the result. And that takes a lot of practice and a lot of discipline and a lot of trust in the process. And again, trust in preparation and trust in one another. And none of these things are, there's no silver bullet that's going to create any great team. A lot of it is just bringing people together and just having some really good, clear conversations about what do we expect of ourselves, what we expect of others, and any new person that wants the privilege of joining this team. This is who we are, and this is what we're all about, and what we want to do. And we're going to lean into one another. We're going to committed to our craft and to our clients and to whomever becomes important in that scenario. And so, yeah.
Yeah. We've talked a bit about stakeholders, like in the context of some of these metaphors that we've been talking about. And I think teams don't operate in isolation. They're part of a system, whether that's the organization or depending on what the construct is. How do teams build really strong alignment with their stakeholders? And is there any strategies you recommend?
I think it's always listening. I think it starts there
Mm.
and creating mechanisms where people can listen and not feel like, yeah, the stakeholders was telling that 2 years ago, so it's still relevant today. So it creates, and maybe it's also kind of what I mentioned earlier about being a student of our craft and instead of being the expert and separating ourselves from our stakeholders, thinking we know better. We don't know better. We have to listen. We have to constantly, I think, stay in touch and in tune with our stakeholders to understand where they are and what their needs are and how we can serve them best in a world that's changing really quickly. And this is going to be, I think, the real challenge for teams going forward, and why, with AI and everything else, we better get the people part right. I think that's going to be really, really important. And to create that collective intelligence in an organization. We have our human intelligence, we have our artificial intelligence, and creating a kind of collective intelligence that is committed to learning and growing. I saw a post on LinkedIn recently that was written by the senior VP of communications, is the Dean Acosta, and he's talking about AI inside of the communication team at Lockheed Martin. And all of these leaders operate different business units and all of that with regard to their communication. But the iterative approach they were taking and how it was all about like try, fail, try, succeed, try whatever, right? But it's very much a process of trying to just really figure it out through experimentation
Mm.
about what was going to work best. And I think when you get teams that are really capable of doing that, capable of failing forward, if you
Mm.
will, which is really what it's all about, right? Have an attitude that you win some, you learn some. That's it. There is no lose here.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that makes an enormous difference as well.
Yeah. And what it requires that collective accountability and us breaking down silos. Because what I'm noticing, especially in 2025, is a bit of a disconnect between the exec level and the next layer of leaders. There seems to be this a bit of a disconnect. And I think you talked about communication before and this collective intelligence. And I feel like there's an opportunity to both have horizontal leadership as well as vertical leadership. I'd love to know your kind of thoughts on this.
Well, one of the things that comes up a lot is when you look at, it's not like organizational change has the greatest track record in the whole world.
Yeah.
Okay. Either by
Not at all.
success or underperformance or anything, right? To say the least. McKinsey and others will tell you one of the big reasons for that is that so often you can't get your people behind whatever it is you're trying to do to the degree necessary to really make it successful. And this is why this idea of recognizing that it can't just be done top down, that you have people in your organization who may not be the most senior level folks in the whole world who are really influential with other employees.
Mm.
You want to identify who those people are. You want to make sure that when you can, get input from them on what change you're going to make sure that they understand, like, hey, how are we messaging it to the employees and how's that going to feel? At the very least, you want to at least make sure that they understand the why behind what you're doing. because not if, but when those sense making exercises take place, right? Which is what we all do. We hear information about change. It's not like we go back to our desk or go about our business and just go on. We're engaging our fellow employees. What do you think about this? We like it, don't like it, good, bad, all of these kinds of things, right? And so this is where we have to recognize that it's what runs horizontally through our organizations that gives its vertical structure strength and
Mm.
stability. And so we need to engage at every level in the organization. And there's a certain intentionality that comes with that. There's a certain understanding, for example, that when you work in groups, you figure out why that matters so much. And so I think that when you can see your job as a leader is not just top down, but it's lateral as well. And the
Mm.
more you remain engaged in those conversations, and by the way, not to mention that, yes, change is going to become that much more rapid and all of that's one thing. But to your point about maybe some of the disconnect in leaders and the rest of the team, right now you're at 64% of the workforce is millennials and Gen Zs, and by 2030, it's going to be 75% between the two. That's a big change. That's a shift. And these aren't generations I would regard as naturally trusting of hierarchical leadership. So
Mm.
whatever's taking place horizontally in your organization now, dial it up a couple notches over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And so if you're either going to be engaged in that dialogue or not, and I think it's going to be essential for leaders to be engaged at that level.
Yeah. And I just think it's so important to build relationships across the organization so that you can influence and being really intentional with that as well. Excellent. So the final question I've got, Leo, for you is if you could leave our listeners with one message about thriving teams, what would that be?
Wow. One message about thriving teams. I think that, and this is going to, I think we're better together. I
Mhm.
think we have to recognize that, but that the power of we begins with each of us. And I think this is where we have to look within ourselves and ask ourselves, how can I be my best self for this team and for the folks that I'm serving? And if I can set that example and we can all do that for one another, it's a pretty great start.
Excellent. I love that. I do think the sum is better than the parts. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Leo. I've learned a lot and it's been great having you on the Thriving Leaders podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been delightful. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. What an energizing and deeply human conversation with Leo. I hope that conversation left you thinking, not just about how your team works, but how you show up in it. What stayed with me most is Leo's challenge to reimagine creativity as an everyday leadership practice. That thriving teams are intentional. We need to trust intent, create psychological safety, and make feedback normal and not awkward. Healthy peer pressure lifts the bar of performance, so we do need peer accountability. And I love the intentional rituals. They're key. Celebrate the wins, reflect on progress, and embed learnings. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Leo's work and other leadership resources to support your growth. Until next time, keep thriving. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers on Audible, Spotify, and Kindle. If you liked this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.